And yeah, I think we should be good. Alright, hey guys, what's going on? It's time for another annotated video. And today's game was played, what, yesterday? I think it was yesterday. It was played at the Thad's latest tournament, the Atlanta Class Championships. And the reason I'm showing this game is because the style of game played was interesting because me and my opponent both have a very similar style. I was playing a guy who's new to Georgia whose name's Anthony Parker, and Anthony is known for having an extremely aggressive style. We played once at the Castle Chess Tournament, the last round, which we both tied for first in the expert section, and yeah, he just threw literally just all he did was just develop his pieces and slowly pushed him at my king, and it got really scary. I was really lucky to get a draw from that game. Anthony's a new guy. He's from, I think, Minnesota, and his rating is nearly 2,200. It's been like 2,190, 2,185, around there. So he's almost a master. And yeah, again, this guy's just he loves to attack. That's what Anthony does. And the line we went into, as you'll see, lends towards attacking. So without further ado, I'll get into the game. I was playing as white. Yeah, so Anthony played, or excuse me, I played d4. That was responded to with d6. So this is the Pirk's opening. Normally, black's going to play g6 and develop his bishop and then maybe play c5 and such. It's kind of like a Sicilian dragon, but black doesn't exactly try to exchange the c-pawn for the d-pawn. He sometimes tries to use that c-pawn as a weapon. I play d4, knight f3, knight c3 here, and bishop e3. So the way I like to play against the Pirks is this system. I think it's called the 150 system. To be completely honest, it's one of the most aggressive ways you can play. It's literally just, okay, black fianched out of their bishop. We're going to play bishop e3, queen d2, queenside castle, and just go for mate. It's kind of like, again, very similar to the Yugoslav attack in the Sicilian Dragon. So yeah, to me, it's one of the most aggressive systems, and I mean, apparently, some pure Pirks players say, like, oh, it's not supposed to be that good, but I've seen even GMs use this, and I think it's a very good weapon to use against the Pirks. So bishop e7, f3, c6. So yes, normally black is best advised, at least in my opinion, as somebody who plays the system, black is best advised to hold off on castling for a while. There's even sometimes you can pretty much get away with just like waiting for a while. And sometimes black will just play h6 and leave the king in the center. So black's plan is to go for c6 and b5, a5 pawn storm. So notice that pawn in c6 is to support the b5 thrust, just like white's pawn in f3 is to support the g4 thrust. So black plays c6, letting his queen come out, getting ready to play b5, and I play queen d2. Now here's where I think, again, just in my opinion, I think it's a better idea to start off with b5. I'm also looking at Livebook right now. b5 is also the top move by far, 315 games played with b5, as opposed to 87 played with what Anthony played with castles. The reason I prefer b5 is because, again, I think it's best to kind of just wait with your king, leave him in the center for a little bit, maybe even play h6, just stall it out and start pushing on the queen side. So I was kind of happy to see castles because this is a little bit less worrisome. So I got my king castled, b5. So black strikes is coming up the board. So here's where I kind of had to figure out what to do. It turns out that actually bishop h6 immediately is not bad. Literally just going caveman, bishop h6, h4, h5 is a pretty solid idea here. But I was trying to think a little bit more preemptively here. And so I figured that I would play king b1. And the idea behind king b1, which by the way, king b1 is the third bet top move, or excuse me, if I rank these by, yeah, excuse me, king b1, the move I chose is actually the top move in the position. At least it's been played most times. And the idea here is that I want to take that knight on c3, and I know it's going to be kicked when he plays b4, and I don't want to put it on b1. I want to put the knight on c1. There's a saying in chess, with the knight on f8, there is no mate, and it's a rhyme that kind of comes from king that's castled kingside from the black perspective. And so if you can imagine a black king castled with a knight on f8 right next to it, that expression, knight on f8, there is no mate, basically says that knight keeps the king very safe. So since I know black's going to throw an onslaught at me, I figured maybe I'll put the knight from e2 to c1. And of course it's not f8, but you get the drift. The knight's doing the same thing on c1. It's protecting my king, and I thought it'd be really good there. I'm probably not going to use that knight to attack on the king side, so I might as well use it as the most defensive place possible. So of course he pushes forward to b4. I play knight e2, heading over to c1, and queen a5. So this is a common move. There's only 3 games from this position so far, and queen a5 has been played once. And yeah, I'm not so sure about this move because one of my questions is kind of like, what's the queen doing on a5? The only thing I can come up with is this plan has to be connected to pushing for c5. Because the queen blocking the a pawn, that's the only other pawn. You push for c5, and then hopefully get the pawn to c4, and then hopefully get the pawn to c3. That would actually be pretty dangerous. So that's the main idea there. However, I just put the knight on c1, getting ready to develop my pieces, possibly bringing the knight to b3, where it would gain a tempo on the queen, and also control the c5 square. So here, knight a6 was played. And this move to me was strange. I thought knight to d7 made a little bit more sense. To me, this made a little bit more sense because you maybe allow bishop a6. Also, if you want to play a5, it just takes one tempo. You got to move the queen and then play a5. And this also helps support the c5 push. So knight to a6 was a little bit strange to me. I wasn't quite sure why I went there instead of d7. So here I was trying to think, should I continue with h4? Should I continue with g4? What to continue with? I started to get a little bit worried about black going for this c5 push. I mean, even if it's a sacrifice, that c5 push can open up the light dark squared bishop, and I just wasn't sure if I was completely ready for that. So I decided to play knight b3 first, and my idea was simply to gain some control over the c5 square. So now I gained a tempo, I gained some control over the c5 square, and now I was ready to start attacking. Keep in mind, though, that knight on b3 is going to be hit with the tempo if the a pawn ever starts running. But for now, I wasn't worried about that. That's far down the road. So now I play h4. Okay, my king's relatively safe. My pieces are decently developed. I need to develop my light square bishop and my knight, but you can count my rook as developed since it's helping in the h file. So I was okay with my development. King's safe. Now it's time to strike. So he plays h5, which I think is relatively important. If you allow white to continue up the board, it's just not going to work out. So here, I was thinking about playing g4. I had the idea in mind, but I got a little bit scared off because there was this line, if I can pull up the notation a little bit. So when g4 takes, h5 takes, h6, knight takes h4, queen d3. And I saw this far in game, and then I thought that after something like, let's say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to adjust the board a little bit more. After something like bishop f6 and queen takes, let's say knight c7. Looking at the position now, I mean, looking at it with an engine, the engine's like, oh, white's just doing amazing, which makes sense. I mean, white's up a piece. But if you're looking at this position in your head, currently black has 3 pawns for the piece. Now, of course, the f3 pawn is falling. But a5, a4 is very quick, and you can imagine a bishop coming to f5 or a bishop coming to e6, maybe a knight coming to b5. I don't know. Again, if you're looking at this position in your head, it's not so cut and dry, if you know what I mean. Not so cut and dry. So yeah, I wasn't too sure about all this. So I decided instead I would first play bishop to d3, protecting the e4 pawn in advance before I play g4. Now you may be wondering, why would you even play g4 in the first place? And this was an idea I think that was popularized by Bobby Fischer when he was playing against the Sicilian Dragon. The idea is to play g4, distract the h-pawn away from the h-file, and then just push h5. Often it's a double pawn sacrifice, but it's extremely dangerous for black to play against, and it's a very common theme in how this attack actually proceeds forward. So bishop d3, knight c7, so black's getting ready to quickly push a5, a4. Also, there are ideas of knight b5, and sometimes even sacking by jumping into c3 or a3. So now I strike forward with g4. So we can see the game starting to heat up. And I was thinking for a while, was my opponent going to take? I thought taking was the most critical line to me. I really did think taking was definitely the most critical. And he could have considered taking as well, but he didn't. And again, this will illustrate, again, part of the dangerousness. If takes, let's say I play h5. Let's say knight takes, keeping everything nice and safe. Because if pawn takes, then at the very least, I can play e5 and get the pawn right back. And I don't know, it's not good. Pawn takes is the worst thing. So let's say knight takes, bishop h6, a5. And now look, rook takes h5. Already, black is falling to bits. Takes, takes, takes. Here, check. Here, and then quiet move. Can you figure out what the white does to win? Simple. mate will come in the H file, and this is game over. There's no point in playing here. So instead of taking, I think my opponent wisely decided to go for a quick counterplay. Again, as to Anthony's style, he's very aggressive. A5 came to the board. So he's rushing his pawns. He's got a tempo on the A4. He's breaking through. I'm breaking through. So now I was thinking again what to do. And this position is just crazy. I mean, if you ask a computer, the computer will say it's slightly, it'll basically say it's equal. Okay, it's giving like a 0.2 advantage to black, and it's saying white should play G5 and close up the position. I don't know, computer. Perhaps that's how a computer would play, but that's not how any humans are going to play. And that's also not how any humans are going to rate this. Position's just wacky. Both sides are throwing everything. I honestly lean towards white in this position, in my opinion. So here I decided to play knight e2. Just develop my pieces. And now I can bring a rook over to the g file, and I can continue my attack. Also, this knight can, well, yeah, this knight can even maybe hop to f4. So a4 was played, kicking my knight back to c1, and then queen a5. I thought this was a pretty decent move. Often in the Sicilian Dragon or in structures similar to this, the queen likes to be on the 5th rank because it just adds extra protection to the h5 pawn. So if there's a capture in h5, sometimes the queen will end up on that square. And so he added some pressure to the h5 square, so I decided to, in turn, add some pressure to the h5 square. Now here, my opponent took on g4, and just as we saw before, the whole point was to play h5. Now again, this is just an attacking motif. If you don't know this motif, and if you don't know this motif, you probably don't play the Yugoslav. But if you need something to play against the dragon, look into the Yugoslav and look into this motif. Because even though it looks like white's just giving away stuff, that's not really the case. For instance, if there any recapture in h5, basically what's going to happen is, I'll put it on the board, for example, let's say pawn takes. I can play e5, and that's just going to be annoying, I think. I think I can play e5 now. Yeah, I can play e5, and this is just going to be annoying. I mean, as you can see, we have two bishops aimed at the king. Well, okay, let's just do simple math. We have 1 light squared bishop attacker, 2 dark squared bishop attacker, 3 with the queen in the battery, 4 with the knight coming to f5 or h5, and 6 with the rook in the game. And black's only got 1 defender, being the dark squared bishop. So you do the math. This is not going to work out well for black, and those pawns are going to fall. It's going to be a mess. So my opponent instead played b3, striking forward. Now notice b3 also offers a trade of queens. So this move, again, was another cool part about queen a5. b3 is now offering a queen trade, which of course makes black's position much safer. And so seeing that, I decided that instead of trading queens, I would play c3, closing it up, not allowing the queen trade to happen, but I was allowing him to capture on the a pawn. So he played taking on a2, and then king a1. Now this is, I think, another interesting defensive motif. I think the computer at first wasn't thrilled about king a1. It thought king a1 was good. King a1 was still much better for white, but it also liked knight takes a2. But then it thought for a while, and it's like, oh, king a1 is actually just about as good as knight takes a2. The idea with king a1 is we use the pawn in a2 as a bit of a shield. For instance, with the king on a2, or maybe even the knight on a2, if a bishop ever came to e6, that would be coming with some sort of tempo. And also, it's like an extra way to keep the a file closed, an extra bit of protection, and I can pretty much take that pawn whenever I want. Black doesn't really have time to go for a3 because of his king. And also, if a3 is ever played, white has b4 gaining a tempo on the queen in a lot of lines. And even if b4 somehow falls out of the range of possibilities, white will also have b3, which is nice and safe, protected by the knight, and then maybe even king takes a2, following up the protection on b3, with again the a3 pawn keeping the king safe on the a file. So my opponent played rook d8 after a lot of threat here. I had an interesting threat in this position that if somebody was not paying attention, they might have missed. For instance, let's say he went for g takes f3. Now, while it may seem that taking on g6 is crushing, there's an even more crushing blow in that there's h6 in this position. And this is just kind of lights out. After bishop h8, we have h7 check. Only real move is knight takes, and then we have queen h2. And we can see that black's now running into problems on the h file. So that wouldn't be great. So my opponent played rook d8, which again, playing this game as a human is tough, man. There's just so much going on. If you look at the board, black still has all 8 starting pawns. Check that out. Black literally has not lost a single pawn. So there's just a lot of things on the board. Oh, to be completely honest, I'm just realizing, yeah, we haven't even traded. Black has not lost a single piece. So all of Black's starting pieces are still on the board with all this mess going on. White also has almost all of his starting pieces, but White's just throwing pawns out the window. So there's just a lot of things to factor in this position. And I think rook d8 was decent. Putting the rook on the d file, his plan was he was going to play e5 at the right moment. And hopefully with the rook on the d file, he was going to be able to um, have some control of the d file if it ever opened. At this point in the game, I was pretty sure I was winning. I mean, it's become clear that White's attack is just busting through. Meanwhile, Black's attack is completely stalled. I took, and then I played Bishop h6, getting rid of the defender, getting ready to bring the queen in, and yeah, it's just straight up looking bad. That's all it really is. He played e5 now. E5 was why is e5? E5, I just felt it kind of needed to be played. I mean, perhaps maybe it's not the best move in the position, but when I remember during the game, I felt like e5 was what was coming, because otherwise I might play e5 myself, opening up my bishop. Yeah, exactly. The whole point of e5 is really to try to shut down the light squared bishop, because if that bishop gets in the game, it might just be too much. So this is a desperate try to shut down the light squared bishop. Now, in my opinion, the best move here is queen g5, simply attacking the g6 pawn. And there's not really a good way to defend it. If, let's say, king f7, we may have take, and then what happens after just rook h6? So what are you doing here? You know, this just looks completely lost to me. And so queen g5 was very strong. The reason I didn't play is because I saw knight g6, and then I don't know if I like short-circuited or what happened, but long story short, I think I just forgot that I can just play queen takes g6 and I have all my trumps. But for whatever reason, I remember saying queen g5, knight e6, and I was like, oh, knight e6 protects the bishop, and it gains a tempo on the queen, you know, and it activates the knight. The knight looks good there. For some reason, knight e6 completely scared me off. So, yeah, that was a little bit unfortunate. Sorry, guys, my nose is kind of itching to me to do all of that. Yikes. Anyway, so e5, I played takes, queen h6, which I think is probably the most attractive continuation. And then here is where things start to get pretty wacky, and I start to lose my concentration. Not concentration, I started to lose my path. So up until here, I pretty much thought I was like just winning like everything. Not everything wins, but I felt like I should have a pretty guaranteed win. But once I got to this position, for one, we were both getting into big time trouble. I'm talking like under 2 minutes apiece, something around that, where it was getting bad. And while it's quite clear that White's attack is something strong, a lot of pieces have come off the board. The knight on f6 is doing a pretty good job of keeping the king safe. I don't really have a clear way of attacking the g6 pawn. The fastest way I can see to attack is maybe queen g5, rook h6, but now rook g8's in the position, so rook g8's a move, and my bishop's not in the game. My knight on c1 can't be used. My knight on g3's stuck out, but the two pawns there. So here I started actually kind of running into some practical issues where I was just like, what do I do here? And I'm running into time pressure. So around this point in the game, I felt like something had gone wrong, or I'd slightly misplayed something. I do think queen g5 earlier was my best path. If you look at a computer, the computer will tell you take on g4 and you're still just crushing. But you can understand how I may not have wanted to take on g4, as one, the g4 pawn hangs with the tempo, and for two, I don't know, maybe just bishop takes g4 also comes with the tempo. I just wasn't sure. The move I opted for was f4. This is also a good move. The idea of f4 is simply just prying open lines, really, adding pressure to that e5 pawn. I wanted to open the f file and put a rook over there, which is perhaps the idea behind taking on g4. And yeah, just as also this pawn can go to f5 someday, and that's another good point. It would not be advised for black to take on f4 because then I'd be happy. I'd play e5 and then I'd unleash my bishop on d3. So just illustrating that this would not be good news for black because yeah, just no. All right, so f4, and then my opponent played a move I really liked and that really caused me a lot of grief. A very great defensive prophylactic move, honestly. It was a great move. He played knight c to e8. So when I first saw the move, I was kind of like, what? You know, it was definitely not one of those candidate moves that jumped into my head for my opponent to play, which is another reason I was so impressed by it. But they say a knight is a king's best friend. Well, look at this. There's not one knight. The king is literally in the middle of two knights that are protecting each other. These knights together control so many squares near the king. Notice, h7 is controlled, g7 is controlled, g8 is controlled. Um, H5, it's just so many squares near the king are controlled, and then they work together so well because they're protected. So this actually just made my task a heartache. There was a weakness with this move. It did drop a pawn. That's what I ended up going for. I took, and then I played bishop e6. With the knight no longer in c7, now after bishop e6, the king has to take, and now I have, at the very least, queen f4 here, or queen takes g6. Apparently knight d3 was stronger, but again, if you try to parse through this game with an engine, it's going to be a long day. So I took on g6, and again, I felt like I definitely should be winning. Okay, the king is on e6, he's running out of squares, but at the same time, I was running very low on time. So again, we're looking at this position, and I maybe have, like, again, 2 or 3 minutes. There was 30-second increment, but maybe 2 or 3 minutes at this point. And again, it's win or not. Right now, if I'm not careful, black has 2 connected passed pawns, and my king is only a few moves away from not being safe. For instance, if black had the time to play a3 right now, that b2 pawn gets undermined, c3 is falling, and then we're in trouble. So I had to try to be accurate. Now here I played a pretty bad move in hindsight. And I played the move in order to hopefully get in one move, but it wasn't that good. I played rook takes d8, which looks weird. Like, why would you go with the d file? And yeah, that's correct. To be honest, actually here, rook h7, double x-clam just wins on the spot with the idea of queen f7. The only move to not lose here is to play rook a7, which indeed hangs a rook, because I can take on a7, then take on d8. But I played rook takes d8, and the idea was, for one, if he takes with the queen, then okay, he's just passive, and I just have a better position. Queen, for instance, something like queen f5. I can play like here, and maybe even just queen takes f4 and just keep playing chess. Okay, I'll play that position. He's completely passive. So the more active moves to take with the rook, but now I have rook h5. And so this move clears the queen off the 5th rank, allowing me to get in some queen f5 type stuff. And unfortunately for me, it turns out he had a pretty strong reply here that's completely based off my next move. And so he played queen b6, and now I played rook h7. Very strong, and this is, again, just much better for white. So for black, it turns out, again, in hindsight, the best move was queen to c7 for the specific reason, cutting out any rook h7 business. And apparently after queen to c7, black has a quote-unquote slight advantage, but again, it's crazy. There's a lot of stuff going on. So rook h5, queen b6, rook h7. Again, the threat is queen f7, the king moves, and then queen e7 should be mate. So, yeah, rather than move king moves to d6 or e5, queen e7 still mate. Also, if black were to try playing rook to d7, then we have problems because there's queen f5, the king moves over, and then there's a variety of things. I think e5 would probably win here. Queen takes f4 is also pretty strong. So yeah, everything's going wrong here. It's not what you want. Alright, so we have queen c5, strong. He basically found the best move in the position. Rook h7 was, I think, best, and queen c5 also was the best defense. This defends the e7 square and also brings the queen back to the 5th rank, defending the f5 square. At this point, again, our clocks were just about running out. My opponent offered me a draw, as I was very low on time. I think I had like 30 seconds or something. And I didn't want to draw. I didn't want to play rook h5 because I felt like he could improve his queen again. So I played knight f5, just bringing another piece into the attack. I'm not so sure, but I was threatening rook e7 here. But regardless, I was bringing another piece into the attack. So again, yeah, there are some rook e7 ideas. There's a queen f7 idea right now. A lot of stuff's going on. So rook d7 was played now. And here, again, I had to come up. Now I was just thinking, I didn't have any set plan, but I knew just keep making threats. That's what Gary Kasparov once said. If you consistently make threats, your opponent will blunder. So here I played rook h6, which, for those not tactically aware, this actually hangs the knight on e8. So now queen takes e8 is indeed a threat, and it's just another problem my opponent has to solve. And the computer, again, still giving white a big advantage here. So king e5, and here's, well, again, I let my foot slip off the gas a little bit, perhaps, from an engine's perspective. I played a relatively natural-looking move, queen g5, which just seems like, a pretty logical way to increase the pressure. However, I had 2 other moves that were definitely much more crushing that, of course, our silicon firm brings out. One is knight to g7, double exclamation mark. While this piece can be taken by 2 different pieces, neither take is good, as there is this looming threat of queen to f5, and there's also, well, yeah, I think this queen f5 is a pretty big threat. For instance, let's say if rook takes g7, not queen f5, knight d3 will indeed pretty much just pick up the queen. We have queen d6. I won't pick up the queen. What am I talking about? But after queen d6, queen takes e8. Again, these are tactics that an engine will see just like that. I don't know how any normal person is supposed to see this, but long story short, the point is everything's hanging. Okay, we have a queen hanging, we have a knight hanging, we have mate hanging. Everything's hanging, so it's just too much. So knight g7 was easily the most spectacular, but also very strong was rook h5. This is also a really cool move. Same idea as queen g5, and this acknowledges the fact that if the knight takes, then now we're hanging more than one piece with problems. So queen takes e8, and that's a fork with the king, the rook, and the knight. So as you can see, white's doing quite well here. So that would have been nice as well. But queen g5 actually allowed this move, knight takes e4. Now this move looks a little bit counterintuitive because it seems like it just drops the g4 pawn. And this, I'd say knight takes e4 is a bit of a computer move as well. Because yeah, it just drops the g4 pawn, and the fifth rank is just one move away from being completely open. It just seems weird. Like, why would you do that? But the idea is that the other knight's coming into the defense. So for instance, if queen takes g4, just the other knight to f6, and like, what's really going on here? You know, is this really that good? Also, the queen's being attacked right now. So there are no real discoveries that work. However, I just want to show you guys a really, really cool draw line, a really, really cool force draw that goes check, knight takes, here, and then since white is down material, white literally draws a perpetual check like this. I don't think I've ever seen a two-knight perpetual check. Like, that was crazy. Just the knights are just trapping the king. I literally don't think I've ever seen a perpetual like that. Queen sacrifice and then perpetual check with the two knights. Also, keeping in mind that the knight on d6 is currently being attacked by 1, 2, 3, 4 different pieces. Yet that knight is an instrumental part in the perpetual check. So that was a really cool line. However, after after knight takes e4, white could play one with perhaps slight chances, and white could play queen g6, and then we might see knight 8 to f6, bring the other knight, and then after knight g7, the game could continue. And again, it's razor sharp, extremely unclear. Black's king is not safe at all. Black has two connected passed pawns, and black literally has all of his pieces around the king. So that could have happened. Instead, though, my opponent opted, again, he was also in the same time pressure for queen g1, which is kind of an all or nothing move. Queen g1 basically highlights the fact that the knight on c1 has nothing. It has no protectors, and queen takes c1 is coming with the check, which is going to be a tempo. And yeah, and pretty much this move is just kind of just betting that he's not going to get mated. So here I played knight to d4. He played king takes e4. King takes d6, or excuse me, king d6 definitely was trying a little bit harder, because here I play queen takes f4 here and then e5. This is a really cool move. We were in time pressure, so I didn't necessarily see this in game, but this isn't a hard combination to find. Knight d4 and then, oh, excuse me, after king d6, I mean, so let me scroll down a little bit. King d6, we have queen takes f4. That's pretty easy. Notice queen takes f4 also solves the problem in c1. And then again, after king c5, e5 is just crusher. Notice the knight is pinned because of the rook takes c6 checkmate threat. And so this is obviously losing. Now the king is just, it's done. So my opponent instead opted for king takes e4. And I think his idea was to try to run the king possibly behind the pawns, and then maybe get in like f3 at some point, and then he still got the threat on c1. But he didn't quite make it that far. I play queen f5 check. King went into e3. And notice how it went from the black king was surrounded by black knights, which were the king's best friend, to now the black king is surrounded by two white knights, which, when combined with the queen, is literally probably the two worst minor pieces to get stuck in between. So the knight and the queens just work together. We have queen e6 check, king here, queen d2 check, and again here I'm just playing kind of off increment. I know he should be losing, but I'm trying to find the win here. And now I really wanted to win his queen, but it was just kind of hilarious that knight c to e2 is illegal, and knight d to e2 also seems to drop a queen, although it really doesn't. It's possible, but in the game, me and my opponent both chuckled because like I'm like almost flagging here. I have like a minute left, and I want to fork the king, but both moves just kind of gave the queen, so we both noticed that. We both literally chuckled at the board as I was like, come on now. But it didn't take me long to figure out that there was knight f5 check. And this very swiftly ended the game after queen to e2 checkmate. So definitely an interesting king walk. King went from g8 all the way to f3. Took a while, but hey, we got the king out there eventually. This game was by no means perfect, but I think it was just a great clash of dynamic styles. Again, Anthony is a really dynamic player, throwing stuff up the board, and I mean, knight, for instance, bringing that knight back for defense. I don't know if I would have come up with that idea. I mean, he did, but that was just a really good plan. This whole rook d8 knight back defense was good for him. Also, even credit for him for even going for this line, because this line, like I said, it's very aggressive, and it's one of those where both players are throwing the house at each other. And like I said, White, I actually played pretty well. Even in time pressure, a lot of these moves were pretty decent, except for this whole rook takes d8 was pretty much not that good, and also was queen g5. But other than those two moves, everything was pretty solid here. Everything was pretty solid. And yeah, it was just a really fun game, and we both had a good time playing and even going over the game afterwards. Alright, so I know this video's probably ran forever. You guys are probably tired of watching me scratch my nose and such like that, but hopefully you guys may have learned a new line to play against the Pirks. I think it's called the 150 attack. I don't know. I was just playing it and then heard it had a name, but yeah, I think it's called the 150 attack. It's really aggressive. It's really fun. So yeah, I encourage you to get out there, try it out. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. So I'm going to go find XSplit. And let's stop this broadcast somehow. All right.